One of the best things about knitting and crochet is the ability to customize your projects, to make something truly unique even when you are using published patterns and commercially made yarns. But are you aware of just how much control you have over a finished object through material selection and the multitude of options available to you if you are willing to work with more than one strand of yarn? Welcome to the realm of yarn alchemy and the amazing transformations you can achieve with it. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Shauna and I am a yarn addict with chronic knitting, crocheting, and spinning impulses who just happens to also love helping others on their yarn journeys. I am also a chronic fiddler and I'm constantly trying to fit square pegs into round holes, it seems. But since yarn is a pretty forgiving medium to experiment with, the fun discoveries have thankfully outnumbered the disasters. Now, before we dive into some of the more advanced stuff, let's cover the most basic and traditional forms of yarn alchemy, being the use of carry-along strands. The most typical carry-along strands are a fairly thin strand normally, and they are used to augment the base yarn of a project, to give it additional attributes. First up, we have the most commonly called for carry-alongs, the Mohair and Mohair silk blends. These come in a huge range of colors, and they provide a soft halo, a little extra warmth, and add almost no weight or bulk to a finished project. For example, this is Ariel from Barocco, and this little 25-gram ball contains 284 yards. It's so fine, you can't even really feel it when it lays across the palm of your hand. Now, up next are the glittery options, and there is huge variety in this category. This lightweight, shiny carry-along has tiny little paillettes of the same color spaced along the strand. This one has a much higher concentration of a contrasting color paillette for a lot more sparkle. Now, it's not real common to find carry-alongs with larger sequins on them, but they are out there. Now, glitter without paillettes or sequins is also an option. For just a tiny glint here or there, you can use sparkle sewing threads from the fabric store, lice weight sparkle yarns like this gold one I crocheted into a virus shawl, or you can go major glamour level glittery with things like Armé here. This is a fingering weight in your face sparkle strand, and I've seen this style of sparkle in weights like DK and worsted, although they are not as common. And the third most common type of carry-along is strictly utilitarian, and that is a reinforcing thread used for adding toughness and longevity to things like toes and heels of socks. You can buy cards of this online in a variety of colors, and a few sock yarns like Javol come with spools of matching reinforcement thread inside. Now, my personal favorite for this purpose is a super fine silk and stainless steel blend from Ito called a Tetsu. It is so fine it disappears into almost any other yarn, and you can't feel it at all. No, we are definitely not talking about calories here. We are talking about manipulating the effective weight of your yarn, the size of your completed project, and even the density of different sections of fabric within the same garment. But why bother doing any of this at all? Just for starters, you can fabricate thicker weights of yarn from lighter ones and get extra benefits in the process. It's a little like having the perfect yarn for a project milled just for you. Here's an example of where this comes in handy. Just on Ravelry alone, there are over 140,000 different knit and crochet patterns that call for either a bulky or a super bulky yarn. Because of the amount of material involved in making something that thick, those two weight categories tend to be expensive, and unfortunately the color content and texture selection tend to be a little limited. That's one reason quite a few of those patterns that you find that call for those weights actually call for 2 or more strands of a lighter yarn. In my personal experience, it's actually less work and fuss to multi-strand than it is to change a pattern to accommodate a different size of yarn. But how do you go about choosing yarns to double up if your pattern doesn't specify? As a general rule, 2 strands of the same weight work together equal the next weight up. So 2 lace weights generally function as a fingering weight, 2 sport weights substitute for a DK, and so on. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. The fiber content and construction of a yarn can affect this ratio, and swatching can tell you a lot. Personally, I really like the look and feel of a multi-stranded fabric. If you have never seen or felt it, it can be very plush feeling and has a more luxuriant appearance. Let's look at a few patterns that show this weight manipulation in action. These are the My Wave Tee and the Sweetie Gatsby patterns. The yoke of the Wave Tee is worked with one strand of a yarn and a smaller size needle, and switches to 2 strands of the same yarn and larger needles for the body. The Sweetie Gatsby is one size of needle for the bulk of the garment, with 1 strand of lace weight for the peplum, sleeves, and yoke, with a sport weight added in for the body section. By the way, links to all of these patterns will be in the video description, so don't worry about writing them down right now. Here are the plateau and inlet tops by Yumiko Alexander. Each project is worked on a single size needle. The same size yarn is used throughout, but the sections where the yarn is held double involves a secondary color. The Cardi V-neck and the Primaveral are 2 examples of patterns that take advantage of the fabric texture you get from multi-stranding, plus leveraging content and structure. The V-neck calls for 3 strands of a lace weight held together, but worked at a worsted weight gauge, and the other calls for 2 strands of a soft, rustic fingering weight worked at a DK weight gauge. Both projects require yarns that will bloom when washed, a large enough gauge to let that happen, and both will result in a fabric texture that is almost impossible to achieve with a single strand of a thicker yarn. Now, before you start to think that all of this is just about clothing, these principles apply to any sort of pattern. Multi-stranding is a great way to upsize a pattern. This is my sofa spider. The pattern recommends a worsted weight, but I used a double strand of a bulky yarn, so he came up big enough for me to cuddle. Now, by the way, if you like the idea of getting all these benefits, but the idea of working with more than one yarn bugs you, stick around to the end of this video. I'll be sharing my favorite tips on how to multi-strand with the least amount of stress or work, because no one wants more of either in their life. We've already covered mohair strands for adding halo and softness, but let's look at examples of other things we can manipulate. Loose single ply yarns like this one tend to be super soft but not very strong. You can improve their strength and durability by working them with a strand of a quality sewing thread or maybe a lace weight yarn. You have a pattern that calls for all wool and you want to cut down on how warm it will be, you can consider the tactic that this pattern used. Camisole number 6 calls for 2 strands, a 100% wool worked with a 100% raw silk. That marled look of the fabric is great. The texture of the raw silk will blend really well with the texture of the wool, and that combination is definitely going to make this cami a lot more pleasant to wear for a lot more of the year. The Ponte top calls for 2 strands of Ito Kinu, and I actually have some in my stash. This is a super light, super soft lace weight that is 100% silk with a heathered or tweeded look, but a single strand of this is almost too light. But hold it double like this pattern calls for, and suddenly you get all of its wonderful attributes plus enough weight for a garment like this to drape really well. If you are working with a difficult to read texture like an alpaca boucle, a carry-along strand of a similar color can make it much easier to work with and to count your stitches when you're working with it. Use a lace weight cotton linen blend or a raw silk with a fingering weight superwash wool to improve blocking on a lacework shawl or an all-over lace sweater. Or use a viscose or mulberry silk with a wool blend to improve drape but maintain warmth in a scarf or a stole. Whatever effect you are going for, don't be afraid to try. Your stash and your craft are supposed to be your playground, and there are no yarn police who are going to come for you if your idea doesn't work out. Yeah, all that other stuff was useful and interesting, but now it's time for the really good stuff, right? Color is a major driving force for most yarn fiends, so let's dig into the tremendous number of ways you can influence things visually. In a very real way, yarn is like paint. You can mix it to come up with new colors or color effects, but unlike paint, you can change your mind and try something else if you didn't like it. You can tone down a variegated yarn that's a little too intense, or you can highlight the colors in more subtle pastel blends. You can add interest and depth to solids and neutrals, use color to mimic a physical texture, and the possibilities for creating custom gradients is endless. When fades started to become really popular with knitters around 2016, they reminded me a lot of the painted crochet gradients I was more familiar with. In crochet, painting refers to projects worked with 3 strands at a time normally and involve periodically dropping an old color strand and replacing it with a new one to slowly shift through the colors. It's such a stunning effect that I purchased this book just for the chapter on that technique. Of course, you aren't limited to thread or lace weight to do this. You can do this with heavier yarns on blankets or cardigans or anything else you feel like. In the knitting world, it's far more common to see only 2 strands called for in projects like the assortment of Andrea Mowry's Fade series or this fun kids sweater from Hedgehog Fibers. You can even fade mohair carry-along strands across a heavier background color like this Antoinette cardigan does. What a gorgeous effect, yeah? When it comes to other color strategies, you can achieve the kind of subtle visuals you see in this cowl, this poncho, and this hat. Or you can create an intense and in-your-face visual like this cardigan that paired busy electric brights with a dark but highly contrasting background color. You can simultaneously dilute and highlight a crazy colored yarn by pairing it with a basic neutral, or in the same pattern, you could choose a partner yarn that only lets little pops of color come through. Really, folks, the sky is the limit. Try pairing random things from your stash together and see what happens. I once paired a rainbow variegated with a medium gray, and this is what happened. Unless you consistently play yarn chicken, the more projects you do, the more stash you end up with. Then there are the yarns purchased for projects that never happen, sales online, sales in stores, subscriptions and yarn clubs, gift yarn, and well, stash just happens. There are plenty of great stash buster projects out there, but my personal favorite is Applied Yarn Alchemy. It uses up more stash and it does it fast. Seriously, why not double or triple the yardage a stash busting project is going to burn through for you and enjoy the rapid gratification you get from working with larger hooks and needles? I personally love making stuffies with leftovers. There are so many cute things that benefit tremendously from busy yarn combinations. Hats and shrugs are generally easy to do this with, and so are blankets and bags. Honestly, any project where gauge and fit don't have to be precise is a win here. There are a few things you can do to make yarn alchemy adventures more successful and certainly more fun. First off, swatch. Yes, I know some of you consider that a dirty word. You can get some idea of how 2 or more yarns will interact in a project by twisting the strands together, but if you aren't sure, do a simple swatch. Even unwashed, you can learn a lot from a little 2" by 2" square if gauge doesn't matter, or a 5" by 5" square if it does. Either way, doing this lets you make certain before you follow up on my second tip, and that is to wind your yarns together in advance. This applies mostly to projects using the same yarn combination throughout an entire project. When I made my Sequoia vest here from 3 strands of United, this big cake was much easier to work from than managing 3 individual balls of yarn all at once. And when I made this shrug, I used 5 different yarns together, and that pre-wound cake made a quick project go by even faster. If you are doing a fade or a gradient, you really want to keep your yarns separated, and I've always found small ceramic mixing bowls really helpful when I'm working at home on the sofa. And if you're on the go, keeping each ball in its own little Ziploc bag inside a larger project bag is definitely more useful. Now, tip number 3 is yarn content dependent. If you are using a strand of something slippery and the tails are likely to work loose after you weave in your ends, use a drop of freight check or a similar clear fabric glue to tack it down after you have washed and blocked your item. It only takes 1 tiny little drop, it dries in less than an hour, and I love that these little bottles are small enough that I can easily keep one in my big craft bag. Finally, there are a few things you really want to keep in mind when you are making your initial selections on yarn, like making sure that if your item is going to require a heavy blocking, you use yarns that will all hold the shape that you block them into. You also want to make sure you have adequate yardage on all of your component yarns, and you want to remember that a machine washable yarn paired with one that isn't means you're still in for hand care for that item when it's done. So I hope you are now ready to go pawing through your stash and maybe find yarns that will make nice playmates. And I hope it excites you to know that you are not limited to working with whatever's available for purchase in the weight category specified by any given pattern. Yarn Alchemy may not be the answer to every yarn selection you come up against, but it can be a truly powerful tool for problem solving, creating one-of-a-kind objects, and using up stash. If you have ever multi-stranded in a project and come up with something unexpectedly wonderful, please leave me a comment and let us all know what you use. I love seeing other people's combinations. If you have any questions about anything I talked about here today, please leave me those in the comments as well, or feel free to send me an email at the address listed in the show description. Thanks for watching today. Please share this episode with other yarn fiends in your life who might enjoy it, and make sure to take a little time to make things that make you happy.